Hi everybody. The focus of the module for the next few weeks is going to be respondent and operant conditioning. I know what you're thinking, right? You've already discussed respondent conditioning. You've already discussed operant conditioning. But what we're going to do is go into a little more detail on things and address maybe some things that you don't or haven't been exposed to yet. That being said, we are going to review the basic concepts because these are areas that you should be absolutely fluent with. If you find yourself looking up basic concepts or not being exactly sure what I'm talking about, you can touch base with me and we'll figure out ways to help increase those skills, or what I would recommend is for you to start engaging in behavior to make it more likely that you will be learning these skills and be able to talk about them fluently. So that being said, let's get started. Like I said, we're starting from the beginning in some ways. So, behavior. Obviously, that's the whole point of the program you're in, is to discuss behavior. So really quick, as fast as you can, what is the definition of behavior? All right, hopefully you came up with some variation of any movement of the muscles or glands that leaves a detectable impact on the environment. If that's not the definition you had, more broadly, you might be talking about anything that an organism does. For me, I find it really helpful to consider that movement of the muscles or glands. Sometimes when we get into a little more complex analysis, we may have difficulty detecting whether some type of event is a behavior or not. But basically, if your glands and or muscles are moving, behavior could be occurring. At this point, as future behavior analysts, I know that the way you think about behavior, the way you talk about behavior is behavior occurs because of some impact with the environment. And when we're talking about those explanations for why behavior is occurring, we're going to talk about one of three potential types of explanations. One, the behavior occurs because of some type of respondent conditioning. Two, it occurs because of some type of operant conditioning. Or three, it's a reflexive relation. Today we're going to discuss reflexive relations and respondent conditioning. However, as you might remember from past courses or looking at the task list, there could be an interaction with operant conditioning at times. So we'll be discussing that potential interaction between operant and respondent conditioning in next week's lecture. So look forward to that. When thinking about reflexive relations, it's going to be really important that you're thinking about just that, right? When we talk about them, we're talking about reflexes. So any behavior that any member of a species will engage in. So all humans may react the same, all dogs, again, react the same, cats, you understand where I'm going with this. So all reflexive relations are going to be where an unconditioned stimulus elicits an unconditioned response. Notice when we talk about any type of explanations of behavior, you need to consider both the environment and the response. So in this situation, no learning has occurred. No conditioning has occurred. Simply, an unconditioned stimulus elicits, notice that E word, that unconditioned response. So let's think about some examples. In a situation, I don't know about many of you, but I've gone to the eye doctor a lot. And as soon as that eye doctor puts a puff of air in my eye or a bright light in my eye does the same exact thing. What's that reflexive response? I'm going to go with eye watering. You could also talk about a blink response. And in that situation where simply the light or simply the puff of air elicits a blink response and there's no history of reinforcement, I'll go with it. But simple puff of air, light, eye water, we go right back to that. Stimulus elicits a response, nothing else. Coughing. could potentially be another reflexive relation. However, we don't know it is until we spell out the entire paradigm. So when coughing occurs, because there is a bit of liquid on your vocal folds, that's what it is. Liquid elicits coughing. This is in humans, and most humans will initially respond in the same way. Talk about reflexive relation, that's absolutely it. Now, think about the behavior in this picture. Remember the movement of the muscles or glands. So my guess is we're going for some type of fear response. In terms of the reflex, it could be increased heart rate or just the gasp response, maybe a quick flinch. But thinking about all of those different responses that may occur, what type of stimuli might elicit these reflexes? Most likely some type of loud noise or some type of intense environmental event, right? Intense novel stimulus change, loud noise, earthquake, flash of light in a dark room, unexpected, novel, intense stimulus change. Notice all three of these would occur with no learning involved, no history of learning. I know I'm being a little repetitive, but you want to make sure that the correct stimulus characteristics of the definitions and of the examples will start to control your identification behavior. Now I'm going to give you a minute to come up with your own example of a reflexive relationship or a reflexive behavior. Make sure you talk about both the stimulus that elicits the response and the response. Now, obviously, I can't tell you whether you're right or wrong in this situation, but the things you can look out for is, one, is the response something that would happen with all members of that organism's species? Thinking even from a newborn status. Two, does an environmental variable, or have you explained the environmental variable that'll elicit that response? And then three, making sure that as we go through talking about respondent conditioning and operant conditioning, or what you already know about respondent and operant conditioning, neither of those conditioning paradigms would explain that behavior occurring. If you would like to email me your example or use the Ask the Group function on the discussion board, I would be more than willing to give feedback. Now we are at our first lecture check-in. So which of the following would be the best example of a reflexive response? Hitting a mosquito that lands on your, or that bites your arm, coughing when someone says cough or I say cough, your heartbeat increasing when exercising, or saying yes when the doctor says, does this hurt? Okay, and the correct answer here is C. When you exercise, your heart rate will increase, and we know that heart beating, right, is an example of a behavior because your heart is a muscle. So the increased heart beating when you exercise would be an example of a reflexive response. Talking about each of the other three, they both note at a type of operant conditioning. When a mosquito lands in your arm, there may be an initial flinch response, which may be reflexive or respondent, but we hit a mosquito because in the past, hitting mosquito resulted in removal or decrease of the sensation of the biting, right? Negative reinforcement. We cough, even though we talked about coughing as a potential reflexive response earlier. When you cough, when someone says cough, it's probably because of some history of reinforcement. And you say yes when a doctor says, does this hurt? because of most likely some type of history of reinforcement as well. So those are the things that you might think about when trying to determine whether there's a reflexive response or some type of conditioning paradigm in play. So now let's talk about sensitization and habituation. One of the things I said was that reflexive responses occur the same in most members of a species. And why I say to look down at the newborn function is because there are ways that reflexive responses are more likely or less likely to occur, and that's because of sensitization and habituation. Like I said, both sensitization and habituation will result in changes in responding in that stimulus-response relationship that we talked about before, but what it's going to really address is the directionality of that change. So sensitization occurs and results in initial increases in the sensitivity or the effectiveness of that stimulus-response relationship. So in terms of sensitization, a behavior will be more likely to occur in that stimulus-response relation. It's important to note that sensitization is actually a temporary effect, and it's when that initial presentation of a stimulus in the stimulus-response relationship will result in increased responsiveness to that stimulus. Sensitization is something I think we've all experienced, and thinking about when an initial stimulus presentation will increase the responsiveness to that stimulus can be really well determined in terms of examples, So thinking about it, in examples where we talked about the initial fear response, right? Very loud noise will result in a fear response, increased heart rate, the gasp, that face that the young child was making in a previous example. So thinking about it, if you're in an area where construction is going on, the initial sound of a loud jackhammer will absolutely result in those types of responses. However, as the jackhammer continues to start to, make noise. I'm not exactly sure of what jackhammers do. So as that noise continues or starts and stops more often, there is going to be potential less effects. But that initial effect, that initial response will make increased sensitivity at the beginning, so to the jackhammer noise. So thinking about it in terms of a little more clearly, if there's someone doing construction across the street from you, the jackhammer goes, you have the initial response, and then the jackhammer stops. That initial presentation will make the responsiveness to the littlest jackhammer sound, or a jackhammer occurring again, even more likely. It's that increased responsiveness. Perhaps a better example, or an easier example, or one that we talk about more often, is you always hear that phrase, you can't just eat one potato chip. So thinking about a situation where we're talking about the saltiness or all that potato chip sensation will increase the likelihood or will elicit salivation. That first potato chip will result in increased sensitivity, increased responsiveness to the next potato chip, right? You're going to have more salivatory responses elicited following that first potato chip. But this only happens for a very short period of time. Temporary effect. Habituation has the opposite effect on these reflexive responses. It actually results in the decreased responsiveness to a specific stimulus. I started to talk about this in the jackhammer example, but didn't want to. What is interesting about habituation is while the sensitivity to sensitization was a very temporary effect, habituation can result in a more permanent or a longer effect than sensitization. So in this situation, when the stimulus is presented repeatedly, it will result in decreased effectiveness. So again, let's move to some examples. An example of a horse and fireworks. When a horse will be around, initially fireworks will result in a number of elicited responses in horses. You'll see head shaking and kind of jumping and moving, and it's been reported that their heartbeat increases. However, as that fireworks show goes, the bang of the fireworks will come to elicit those responses less and less and less. Similarly, if you go to the dentist and initially sticking instruments in your mouth will result in a gag reflex, again, very clear elicited response. As tools are placed in your mouth more and more, the gag reflex will be less likely to happen. So this is a decreased sensitivity to those stimuli, and that's what we're considering. To clarify, when I started talking about habituation in the jackhammer example, there was initially that sensitization where the initial sound of the jackhammer would increase the responsiveness to the jackhammer sound, making you more likely to engage in a fear response. But then as there were longer and longer presentations and more presentations of that jackhammer sound, most likely you would habituate to the stimulus and less likely to engage in those fear responses. So now we are at lecture check-in number 2. You want to read the example and determine if habituation has been described in this scenario or not. So this is actually true. Every time a car stops quickly, an elevator jolts, airplane moves quickly, my mom does elicit, or there is a gasp response elicited. And this is clearly some type of reflexive response. So, when on an airplane though, if my mom would elicit that gasp response, or if that gasp response was elicited at the beginning of flight, and then as jolting happened more and more often, it decreased. Would this be an example of habituation? I hope everybody said true. Absolutely. It's the definition pretty much exactly of habituation. So now we're finally getting to respondent conditioning. When we talk about respondent conditioning, it's really important that at some point you're considering the reflexive relation. Respondent conditioning, although can cycle through, right? That you can have respondent conditioning from previously conditioned stimuli and responses. The ultimate starting point is going to be a reflexive relation. So you want to make sure that anytime you're talking about potentiation for respondent conditioning, that the response at one point could have been a reflexive response. So from that originally reflexive relation where an unconditioned stimulus elicited an unconditioned response, that unconditioned stimulus is paired with a neutral stimulus. This is typically a repeated pairing until that neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. Once it's a conditioned stimulus, we know it's a conditioned stimulus because it comes to elicit the conditioned response. Importantly, in most classical explanations of respondent conditioning, which is also known as classical conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus, or the unconditioned response and the conditioned response are the same. In some of your readings, or in one of your readings at least, you'll talk about situations where this may not be the case. But in the classical models or paradigms, they are the same, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So, to repeat, unconditioned stimulus elicits an unconditioned response. Once that unconditioned stimulus is paired with a neutral stimulus, the neutral stimulus will become a conditioned stimulus and elicit the conditioned response. Let's talk about some examples. I bet many of you can guess what my first example is going to be. It is the most prevalent example of classical conditioning. And honestly, this is the way we talk about respondent conditioning currently. Pavlov did his experiment with his dogs over a century ago, but we are still talking about respondent conditioning the same way. So let's start it off. We know that Pavlov noticed and built equipment to measure the salivation of dogs because meat resulted in salivation with dogs. What Pavlov did was paired that meat or food with the sound of a bell ringing, because that is the stimulus, until the sound of bell ringing elicited salivation. So, breaking it down into the paradigm, which is what you always want to do with respondent conditioning, is the unconditioned stimulus would be meat. The unconditioned response, salivation. That meat was then paired with the bell sound until that bell sound, it alone elicited salivation. I would make sure to be able to break things down into these paradigms anytime you're considering respondent conditioning to have occurred. A lot of times it can be difficult to detect what or identify what would be the unconditioned stimulus or what would be the conditioned stimulus. Once you can do this, you'll make sure that you're talking about respondent conditioning fluently and able to then treat any behavior or respond to it appropriately. So let's do another example. I used to take the T. For those of you who aren't in Boston, the T is the public transportation system. So I would take the T the same time every day. And I would get off the T and walk a block, turn down Brookline Avenue, and the sun would be immediately at the end of the street. So when this happened, my eyes would begin to water immediately. And this happened almost every day. Until one day I had a doctor's appointment, so I went to work later and still took the same route where I got off the T, I walked a block, I turned right onto Brookline Avenue. However, there was no sun. But, interestingly enough, my eyes still watered. So, thinking about that, it is an example of respondent conditioning. So what would the unconditioned stimulus be? I hope you said sunlight. And the sunlight elicited eye water. So then, what was that sunlight paired with? And honestly, it's probably all of the stimuli that made up Brookline Ave. So it could have been the site of the turning at the specific corner with those trees and all of those visual stimuli. But those stimuli then came to elicit the eye water. And the way we know that is the turning on that corner elicited eye watering even when the sun wasn't there. So the control is there. The Brookline Avenue stimuli came to elicit eye watering. And it's really cool, or for me, I find it really cool, that throughout my life I can kind of look at different examples of things that happen to me and guess, right, whether respondent conditioning has occurred or not. Sometimes we can forget how prevalent respondent conditioning and how important it can be in our lives and the lives of clients. It's an entire part of behavior. Our entire class of behavior is conditioned through respondent conditioning, so it's important that we don't discount it. One thing that's worked for me is to walk through my life and identify examples of my own behavior that have been conditioned through classical conditioning. All right, so we're already at lecture check-in number 3. Again, read the scenario, and as you're reading the scenario, I want you to draw out that paradigm and that picture that we showed and determine each of the components of the respondent conditioning paradigm. All right, so this is actually an example that also occurred where I was brushing my teeth and instead of toothpaste used acne cream, which elicited a gag response. And then the next time with a brand new toothbrush, I will also say, so there were no hints of acne cream anywhere around, the gag response also occurred. So, thinking about that, which of the three is the best list of the components of Pavlovian classical or respondent conditioning? I hope you said A. So the unconditioned stimulus would be acne cream, which elicited a gag response. Importantly, that conditioned stimulus was the feeling of the toothbrush in my mouth, because that's what elicited the gag response. Talking about examples B and C, what the error in B would be putting the toothbrush in my mouth as the unconditioned response. That does not meet the definition of an unconditioned response. It would have never been a reflexive relation. So that would be that. And for C, the real problem here would be that the sight of the toothbrush would then be the conditioned stimulus. Thinking about it, it wasn't walking in and seeing the toothbrush that elicited the gag response, although that could have happened. In this scenario, it was the feeling of the toothbrush in your mouth. Thinking about stimuli, we want to make sure that we're considering energy changes that are detected through an organism's receptor cells, meaning something they sense. So while a toothbrush is an item, the stimulus characteristic of interest is the feeling of the toothbrush in your mouth, not the sight. It does help to really determine what the exact stimulation is that elicits a response in terms of respondent conditioning at times. So now we're going to talk about respondent extinction. I know a lot of people will be like, extinction, that is the withholding of reinforcement that results in decrease in behavior. That's actually operant extinction. Respondent extinction is also a process that we'll consider in behavior analysis. So, thinking about it, in a scenario where respondent conditioning has already occurred, as you see here, with the respondent extinction, the pairing of the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus stops occurring. So, if a conditioned stimulus is repeatedly presented without the unconditioned stimulus, what will happen is the conditioned stimulus will no longer elicit that conditioned response. So thinking about it, in that example of my eyes watering when I turned on Brookline Ave, respondent extinction would look like no longer pairing Brookline Avenue with the sunlight. So going at the other time of day repeatedly would result in my eyes no longer watering based on the stimuli from Brookline Ave. In terms of the Pavlovian example, if the bell sound and the meat were depaired, or the bell was continuously presented without presentation of the meat, ultimately that bell would wind up no longer eliciting this elevation response. This can be really important to consider when thinking about respondent conditioning, because it's one way to decrease behaviors that have come about with respondent conditioning. And it's actually a very effective way. So thinking about your next check-in, you want to read the scenario and then identify the stimuli that would be that you'd be looking to unpair or depair. So I've had similar situations to this, not this exact situation, but in a situation where an earthquake occurred in a library. And that earthquake originally elicited a nauseated response and an increased heart rate, or increased heartbeat. What could happen is the library could come to elicit those same responses. So respondent extinction, we would be interested in depairing what? And the answer is D, the stimuli related to the library and the stimuli related to the earthquake. What would happen then in this case is that library stimuli would no longer come to elicit that response. And what the reasoning for this is that the responsiveness would just be way more likely. So thinking about it, if you were looking at letter A, if you depaired the library stimuli and the earthquake stimuli, that nauseated response would be way less likely to happen. So A would be taken care of. So that's why it's important. And a lot of times, you can't depair a relation, which is a stimulus-response relation. So what you're looking to depair is the stimulus-stimulus relation, that pairing of presentation together of the conditioned and unconditioned stimuli. One last lecture check-in question, and this is a very, very important one, where you would like to fill in the blank, assuming that this is a reflexive relation or a respondent conditioning paradigm. So the poisonous stimulus blanked the gag response. I think I've said elicited 40 sometimes in this lecture. That's just a guess. So I hope elicited was the answer. Next week and the week after, we will be talking about operant conditioning. So you'll be able to use the term evoked. Before then, we're talking elicited. So I hope in everyone's responses to discussion questions, I'm seeing a lot of the word elicited. All right, so for the rest of the week, you'll be doing video responses for the discussion board and reading your materials, and I look forward to those responses. As usual, if you have any questions, use the Ask the Group function and or email me, and we will be in touch soon.